let the show begin, as it were. My name is Jonathan Rose. I'm the head of political studies. Some time ago, Wayne Cox told me he was going to use his last lecture in this class time, for those of you who are students in this class time, to talk about his 30 years of teaching and the state of affairs of the subdiscipline of international relations. I managed to persuade Professor Cox, knowing that this would be a big draw for former students, alumni, faculty, and other people who he's influenced over decades of teaching, that we should open it up. And I'm thrilled to see so many people here from Ottawa, Toronto, and other places who've made the trek. It's nice to see former colleagues as well, Phil Wood in the back. Thank you very much. I'm particularly thrilled. The most important person in the audience is actually not Wayne Cox, but Eleanor Cox. So I'm really happy that she's here. Where is Eleanor? Mrs. Cox, where are you? Thank you very much for coming. That's Wayne's mother. So I posted this announcement, and you can see the number of comments that folks made about the impact that Wayne has had on them. And they are an amazingly eclectic group of people. These are former staffers on the Hill. These are staffers on the Hill, entrepreneurs, communication specialists, Bay Street lawyers, professors, and the like. So I think that is also a testament to the reach that Professor Cox has had. We have only 50 minutes, and I could say a lot about the vital role that, Wayne, you played in the department, teaching international relations, and the legacy you've left on countless graduate students and undergraduate students over those years. But I think these words say it better than I ever could. I know Wayne really, really hates having a PowerPoint, and I don't want to trigger him on his last lecture. So with that, I will turn it off and cede the mic to Professor Wayne Cox. Ladies and gentlemen, Wayne Cox.
Thank you, Jonathan. That's the shortest I've ever heard you speak, by the way. He runs our departmental meetings. I'm actually going to lecture you. That's what I do. At 9:30 in the morning on September 11th, an event happened that changed the study of international relations. It was at that moment that I started teaching Paul's 260 at Queen's University. Sure, 9/11 was going on, and it was kind of important. But taking on the responsibility of teaching undergraduate students, I took quite seriously, and I still take it quite seriously. It's something that I absolutely love. I want to give you my conclusion at the start, because I'm kind of postmodern. The conclusion that I will come to is that the study of international relations today in Canada is actually in a very good place, in spite of what universities have done to themselves with underfunding, in spite of the fact that we have all kinds of new obstacles that we don't know what to deal with, like AI, in spite of the fact that I would argue that technology has sometimes become a barrier between students and their mentors. And I think the reason why international relations as a field of study is in a very good place in Canada right now has to do with the evolution of the field. And I want to talk about the evolution of the field a little bit to get you to kind of understand where we are today. There's almost no place that's really easy to kind of start that story, but I'm going to start that story in 1977 when Stanley Hoffman, an American scholar of international relations, wrote a very famous piece. Our graduate students still read that piece. And in it, he referred to the field of international relations as an American enterprise. And at the time that he wrote it, I would say that it was pretty accurate. The gold standard for scholars of international relations was an American Ivy League degree. Almost all of the journals that the scholars wanted to publish in were published in the United States. The debates about international relations were coming from the corridors of American Ivy League universities. The United States was exporting its scholars, and so in places like Canada, for example, at that time when we were expanding our university systems to deal with the baby boomers as they were reaching university age, we couldn't produce enough scholars of our own, and a lot of scholars came from the United States to Canada. Scholars were going from the United States and occupying important research and teaching positions at universities throughout the world. The United States was academically a shining beacon of light. So when Hoffman made this observation, I don't think anybody was surprised. It really was the study of international relations. It really was an American enterprise. But something had happened prior to Stanley Hoffman writing about that. And it was something that was happening throughout all of the social sciences. In international relations, we often refer to it as international relations second debate. But throughout the social sciences, it was called the behavioral revolution. And the behavioral revolution started in the 1960s or so. And in the United States in particular, scholars in the social sciences were looking to the applied sciences, and they were looking at the methodologies they were using. They were looking at how they were accumulating knowledge. They were looking at the great progress that had been made in fields like economics and psychology. And social scientists were starting to wonder whether or not social science should become a science. Should we emulate the scientific approach to understanding the social world? And that debate raged through the 1960s, through the 1970s. And in our field of study in particular, the outcome of that debate, because it was a choice between having methodologies and accumulating knowledge built upon historicism and interpretive kind of takes on context and history, versus emulating the sciences, trying to essentially accumulate value-free knowledge through scientific methodologies. And the choice of the American Academy increasingly moved towards science. And even prior to Stanley Hoffman writing in 1977, you could see a rift starting to occur in the study of international relations. Some scholars celebrated what we call positivist science and behavioralism, and others were very wary of it, and they sort of defaulted back to interpretive history as a way of understanding world politics. So that the dominant discourse in international relations, which was realism, which is a conservative worldview, a worldview that probably captured Cold War politics very effectively. It was a worldview that believed that the state of nature in world politics was one of anarchy, that states were all out there pursuing their national interests in this anarchic world, and that power would determine outcomes. And realists outside of the American lexicon had moved away from science. In 1977, Hedley Bull publishes a very famous book called The Anarchical Society. It's a book that had a tremendous impact upon realist scholars outside of the United States. But in the United States, by 1979, this very famous American scholar named Kenneth Waltz, in writing a book called The Theory of International Politics, in the very first chapter of that book, he argues that international relations needs to become a science. It has to be value-free, he argued. There needs to be a clear distinction between the subject matter, the subject, the object, fact, and value, and that a good theory of international affairs was only good to the extent that it could explain the world, quote unquote, as it is. It was a call to creating a scientific inquiry for understanding world politics. So while Stanley Hoffman is writing that our field is an American enterprise, you could see that the field itself was starting to balkanize. It was moving in two different directions. In the American world, it was moving in the scientific direction. In the non-American world, it was moving in the interpretive understanding, where all knowledge is socially contingent. So when Waltz writes his famous book in 1979, there's an immediate response to it. And the response reflected the polarization of the discipline. Later in the book, Waltz argues, in an attempt to kind of fix realism, this conservative, static view of world politics that was really having problems understanding or explaining what was going on in world politics, he said that we could develop a notion of a superstructure that existed above the level of states. And it was kind of code for a balance of power, because he's describing the world of 1979, and the balance of power was still, at least in the eyes of some, a very real component of world politics. And remember that he's arguing that a theory is only good to the extent that it can explain the world as it is. And if it can't explain the world as it is, it needs to wither away and die. And he says that this superstructure in world politics, this competition between great powers, is a stabilizing force, and it has led to relative peace and stability in world politics in the post-World War II era. And if you read between the lines, what Waltz was arguing was, on the one hand, he had created a scientific, value-free understanding of world politics. And yet, on the other hand, there was a moral obligation by dominant players in world politics to stabilize the international system. And the responses to neorealism were quick. Scholars in the United States embraced this wholeheartedly. It spoke to the primary epistemological, and by that I mean the primary theory of knowledge that had permeated throughout the American Academy. 1984, David Ricci wrote a book called The Tragedy of Political Science. And in the book, The Tragedy of Political Science, he archives the way political science was done largely, but not exclusively, in the United States at that time. It was all about research production. It was all about emulating the sciences. He even claims in that book, if Immanuel Kant was in an American political science department in 1984, he wouldn't have gotten tenure. And he wouldn't have gotten tenure because he really didn't start publishing until he was 57 years old. Ricci argues that he might have gotten tenure if there were enough faculty members to say he shows promise. Maybe someday he will start to publish. And of course we all know that Immanuel Kant has had no impact upon the history of ideas. And so the responses to neorealism were profound. A few years later, the well-known Harvard University professor Robert Cohen decided to edit a collection. And it was called Neorealism and Its Critics. And in that collection, he had some of Kenneth Waltz's chapters from his theory of world politics, the scientific, value-free, neutral understanding of world politics, that claimed that the United States had a moral responsibility to stabilize the world. And then he asked, of all people, Robert W. Cox, a neo-Marxian scholar at York University. Comes as a surprise that there's a Marxist at York University. And Cox eviscerates Waltz, as does Richard Ashley, another critical scholar from the United States. And Cox points out that he's working with a different epistemology. He makes the bold claim that a theory is always by someone and for some purpose. It is reflective of politics. If I had $1 for every time I'd seen that quote re-quoted over and over again, I'd be a wealthy man. But what I found interesting about these debates, and these were debates that were going on as I was entering the discipline, was that at least these scholars were talking to each other. There was a discourse going on. The American Academy espoused not exclusively but largely behavioral positivist scientific understandings of world politics. And sometimes that kind of spun off on steroids. I mean, at some point, have a take a look at Klein's world power assessment. It's pure econometrics applied to world politics. Or Bueno de Mesquita's The War Trap and The War Trap Revisited. Nothing but number crunching analyses of conflict in the world. But they were talking to each other. It was still a discipline. And then a few years later, not much time later, in 1989, my professor at Carleton University, who was a visiting professor from Hebrew University in Israel, Yosef Lapid, who writes a very famous article that all of our graduate students still read today, called On the Prospects of a Third Debate in International Relations. And Lapid was really re-articulating something that Robert W. Cox had said only a few years earlier. Cox had argued that there was not one study of international relations, there were at least two studies of international relations. On the one hand, there was a problem-solving field of study, and it had been around for a long time. It has its origins in 1918, 1919, at the end of World War I, when the academic discipline is created. And he said that it defined itself in very narrow terms. It said, the study of world politics is the study of war and peace, with an eye to finding ways to avert war. It was the end of World War I. It was a pretty grisly set of politics happening. And Cox says, that becomes the American lexicon. It becomes the British lexicon for a long period of time. But Cox says by the 1980s, there's a whole subfield of international relations that actually isn't part of the field of international relations. There are scholars in other disciplines who are observing world politics. And they're rejecting the claim that the big problem is issues of war and peace because there are a myriad of problems confronting world politics. In the 1960s, scholars who were observing Latin American politics come up with dependency theory, a Marxist and neo-Marxist understanding of the unequal division of global wealth. Sociologists in the United States, like Emanuel Wallerstein, come up with world systems analyses. Our old friend Robert W. Cox at York University revisits the work of sociologists like Karl Polanyi, philosophers like Antonio Gramsci, and says, I can re-envision the world as a world not of state actors interacting with one another, but as a world of dominant and subordinated social forces. And so Cox says there is the problem-solving field of study, and then on the other hand, there is critical theory. There is a whole set of alternatives coming from inside and outside of the discipline that are reconceiving world politics in a myriad of different ways. And because they are based upon a theory of knowledge that doesn't make any claim or pretense to be value-free or neutral, they're deeply embedded in their politics. And in the aftermath of Cox's observation, there's an explosion of highly politicized understandings of world politics. Cynthia Enlow writes Bases, Beaches, and Bananas on a feminist interpretation of world politics. And her methodology, oh, it's not number crunching, it doesn't emulate the sciences at all. She actually goes out and speaks to women. She says, what is your lived experience of world politics? And when Lapid comes along and says, we're having a third debate, he is re-articulating Cox's idea that there are two epistemological foundations, two different theories of knowledge, driving the ways in which scholars conceive of the world. I was very fortunate to be at Carleton at the time that Lapid published that article, because we graduate students, we riffed off it immediately. We put an edited collection together called Beyond Positivism, Critical Reflections of International Relations. We didn't think anybody was going to read that book. Within 6 months, the British scholar Steve Smith, or should I say Sir Steve Smith, calls us the Italian-Canadian School of International Relations. A bunch of underfunded graduate students from Carleton, of all places. The Balkanization now had a spatial dimension to it. It wasn't just different theories. It wasn't different schools. It wasn't just different methodologies. They were coming from different places. And the American Academy, if you read people like Nicholas Onoff, tried to wonder why. Why did the American Academy spin off in a different direction? Onoff suggests it has a lot to do with the role that the United States plays in world politics. It's not just a great power, it's a superpower. And international relations serves as a guiding light. I mean, have a look at American Ivy League scholars and the White House. Henry Kissinger, Joseph Nye, Robert Cohen, Condoleezza Rice. They're all scholars of international affairs, and they're all practitioners. Have a look at the funding structures of American universities. And don't think for a second that money doesn't come with certain expectations. It does. The American Academy was awash in funding, but awash in funding that critical scholars like Nicholas Onoff suggested weren't value-free. They were not neutral. They were tied to the interests of the United States. Moreover, in the aftermath of the third debate in international relations, raged through the 1990s, you started to see particularly scholars from the critical school asking a lot of really important questions. Why is the history of world politics focused on Europe and the United States exclusively? Why does it not say anything about colonialism and post-colonialism? Why is it silent about the unequal division of global wealth? Why does it only define war in ways that describe wars that were clearly tied to the interests of Western advanced civilized democracies? What about race? What about religion? What about gender? If this is truly an international field of study, it didn't appear to be very international at that time. We started to see scholars, particularly within the non-American academy, revisiting questions of colonialism, post-colonialism, gender, etc., etc., etc. And Canada stood at the forefront of this. I find that very interesting. I find it very stimulating. I find it very exciting. And then our old friend Osama bin Laden comes along. I'll make a bold statement. Osama bin Laden doesn't get the credit that he deserves for reinvigorating the discipline of international relations. I mean, you know, I was first asked to teach Paul's what used to be called 260 in 1999. It was before 9/11. And it was one of the bigger classes Paul's taught at that time. There were 98 students in it. Then I came to Queen's permanently in 2001. And as I said at the beginning of my lecture, I'm in Dunning Auditorium at 9:30 in the morning on September the 11th, 2001, trying to confront to myself, how the hell do I teach second-year students about world politics? It's not an easy task. And a student runs into the room and says, pardon my language, holy shit, a plane just blew up the World Trade Center. That was a tough class for me. It was really hard to keep the students focused. Most of them ran out of the room. And if there is a good side to this story, it was the next year when I taught Paul's 261, there were almost 400 students in the class. Thank you, Osama bin Laden. And so my journey begins. But one of the tasks that was also given to me, the task that I continue to do to this day, is I have to teach the field of international relations to the graduate students. And back in the day, I suppose, I don't know, I wasn't teaching back then, in 1977, when Stanley Hoffman argued that it was an American enterprise, it must have been really easy to teach the field course, because it was a coherent field. Albeit it had its foibles. It was dominated by the American lexicon. It was myopically focused. It was tied to the interests of the US state. But it was easy to teach. But by the time I got the task, and also the task of instructing you folks, it was a little bit less clear. My good colleague and friend, David Haglund, who's now accumulated tremendous wisdom, is of the opinion that there isn't a field of international relations anymore, because of this balkanization. And so the journey begins as we go through, and what we see in the last 20 years or so, I think, is quite amazing. Remember when I said just a few minutes ago that when neorealism came out, its critics were at least speaking to the American dominant discourse. You read neorealism and its critics, and it's a debate. They're taking jabs at each other. They're being polite. But then by the time Kim Richard Nossel and myself were asked by Ole Weber to revisit the discipline, in I think it was 2012 or so, in a book called International Relations Scholarship from Around the World, we sat down and we had a look at it, and we realized that something had happened in the last 20 or 30 years. And it sort of occurred to us anecdotally. It was like Kim would go to the International Studies Association conference, and when he'd come back, he'd say, oh, who did you see? He said, well, I only went to panels that had to do with English school realism, Australian foreign policy, and Canadian foreign policy, and I went to 10 of those panels, and I saw the same 30 people at all 10 of those panels. There were 10,000 people at the conference. I talked to some of my other neo-Marxian buddies that I have Marxist friends. And say, who did you see at the conference? And they go, oh, well, I saw the same 30 people. Thomas Kuhn, in a very famous article called The Logic of Scientific Revolutions, came up with this concept of a paradigm. And for Kuhn, at very least, a paradigm was a research community. Come on in.
The neo-Marxists.
Okay, let me start from the beginning. For those who weren't here. You all are going to be so lost. So those that are here, after it's over, go over and tell them what I said in the first round, because I'm not repeating myself. So Thomas Kuhn comes up with this idea of a paradigm. It's a research community. Community of scholars share similar assumptions. They utilize similar methodologies. They kind of coalesce together. And what Kim and I were experiencing, the ways in which scholars parse themselves out into these very specific communities. And they riff off of each other, and they build off of each other's ideas, and they accumulate research based upon the research that the others have done. They probably all teach international relations in similar ways. It made us realize that unlike the debates that were occurring in the 1980s, when those who had differing opinions on what world politics was like, and they were speaking to one another, we have now achieved a moment in international relations as a field where these research communities were no longer speaking to each other. There's this little saying that I always just really liked. And the saying was that the difference of love is not hate. The opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is indifference. I mean, think about that. You're 15 years old, you know, your sweetheart is there, and you're, I really like that person. And then you finally talk to that person, and you realize they don't even know that you freaking exist, right? It would be way better if they at least hated you. At least they know that you existed. The American Academy and the non-American Academy, as we portray in the Crimson Tide piece, in the international scholarship, the international relationship scholarship from around the world, essentially makes that argument that what you now have is two increasingly indifferent schools of international relations. What at one time Robert Cox called problem-solving theory versus what at one time Robert W. Cox called critical theory. And the problem-solving theory resides largely, but not exclusively, within the American Academy. And the critical international relations is located spatially, largely, but not exclusively, outside of the American International Relations Academy. Oh, that's not to say that there are not dissident voices coming out of American scholarship. There are. I would hazard a guess that maybe the two most prominent critical scholars of international relations of the last 50 years would be Noam Chomsky and Edward Said, both American Ivy League professors. Both had their careers in the American Academy, but neither were in a political science department studying international relations. And I find that really interesting. I also find it really interesting in this dark era that we're now living in, that I'll call the Trump era, that the silence of American IR scholars to what is going on in the United States is deafening. Maybe I'm wrong, but I was trained to believe that if you want to become a scholar, you have certain responsibilities. You have responsibilities to your student, but you have a responsibility to be a critic of society. The United States has rapidly become a pariah in the international community. The violation of fundamental human rights inside the United States and through the United States applied to the external world, to me, is utterly shocking. And there are dissident voices, the so-called wokes in the United States. But by the way, apparently Pete Hegseth has labeled Queen's University as woke. And if he has, guilty as charged. I am as woke as they come, and I'm proud of it. I hope I'm a part of why he labeled. I doubt it, but I hope I'm at least a small bit a part of that. To me, the silence of the American IR community in the wake of what is going on is telling me a lot about where the American IR community is today. And I don't want to paint it as unified. Because, as I said, there are dissident voices in the United States in the academy. The American university system is ginormous. It is still the largest in the world, the most productive in the world. But what is it about international relations in the United States? And I would argue it's this idea that knowledge is value-free. The claim towards value freedom, towards neutrality, becomes at a certain point a gag order. And yet, outside of the American IR community, as Nassel and I pointed out, there are new centers of knowledge production that are robust, they're pluralized, there's diversity, they're productive, and arguably Canada is at the forefront of that. In this class, because I have to remember I am speaking here, Paul's 262, at one point 5 years ago, I used a textbook by Whitworth and Goldstein. Excellent textbook. I don't use it anymore because they haven't updated it in a while. In the third edition of that book, I was kind of shocked because, you know, we have to read the textbook before you do. And in reading the textbook over the summer, I noticed that Whitworth and Goldstein had listed the 5 centers of knowledge production for international relations in Canada. And Queen's was there. And I didn't expect it to be there at all. And I was kind of like, wow, that's kind of impressive. There's some pretty big political science departments in Canada. We're medium at best, right, Jonathan? Yeah. Size-wise. Size-wise. But there we were. And then 2 or 3 years later, in a journal called Canadian Critical Security Studies, Mark Salter, a prof at the University of Ottawa, and Miguel de Larrañaga, also at the University of Ottawa, wrote a manifesto for Canadian Critical Security Studies. So I started reading that. Well, I had to read it because they asked me to do a rejoinder to it. But I'm reading it, and they go, here's a list of knowledge production centers for critical security studies in Canada, and Queen's is there. I'm like, whoa. This is good. This is very good for Queen's. I wasn't sure exactly why, but you know, if they published it, they came up with some reason. And so a couple of months later, after I noticed that in Sandra Whitworth's textbook, I was having lunch with her, and you know, after how are you, how's your son, you know, all that kind of stuff. How did you come up with Queen's? You got to tell me. And she said, you're a freaking factory. I said, what? She said, you're a factory. She said, you produce so many quality undergraduates. At the time, she was the graduate chair at York University. And I said, yeah, I know. I write like 400 letters of reference a year. And she said, they're the best ones. We compete with other universities to get the Queen's graduates. She said, they know stuff. And, I hope so. I gave them a degree. She said, they read stuff. They read widely. They can write. They can research. And it dawned on me, yes, indeed, we are a center for knowledge production. And this is where I'm going to conclude. The future of international relations is right here. It's you folks. And it's how we train you. Anybody who's taken a course from me will remember, well, probably won't remember, but you should remember, is the first thing I say to you is, my dream is that you will be so excited by the study of international relations after you take this course that you do a PhD. That's the future of international relations. Thank you. I'm young and I'm healthy, and I'm moving on to do all kinds of exciting things like spend time with family, do some hobbies, and produce some music. Woo, woo. So the next album that comes out, freaking buy it. Thank you.